So far in this class, we've taken a look at the megalopolis, which is this region here from Boston down to Washington, D.C. And then we've also talked about the Canadian corridor, which is essentially this area of the St. Lawrence down here to Toronto. And so this sort of also diagonal area in Canada. Now we're going to take a look at the North Atlantic and northern New England. So this space through here. While we do that, in terms of physical subregions, we're going to take a look at the Appalachian uplands, which run through this space right here. We're going to look at the Canadian Shield, which is this area. And then we'll take a look at the continental shelf also, which is this light blue colored area that you can see extending out here away from the shores of these various provinces and states. So as we zoom in and take a look at the Appalachian uplands, we're talking about this area that's the Gaspé Peninsula, and it also includes these running down through here, the Green Mountains of Vermont, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and sort of separate this area from the French corridor here, or the Canadian corridor through the St. Lawrence. So a few things we want to remember about the North Atlantic and northern New England. When we take a look at the physical subregions, the Appalachian uplands, what we have here is a fjord, indented coastline, and a rolling interior. So the fjords are areas where glaciers have receded and left a deep valley between two upland areas, and that area has then flooded. And so we associate those usually with places like Norway, but we have those up there in Canada along the coastline of the Gaspé Peninsula. This is, of course, again, the result of repeated glaciations. So a lot of this area was sculpted by glaciers. And inside this space, so once you get away from the coast, you have a rocky and forested area that's both coniferous and hardwood. So coniferous are cone-bearing trees. Think about pine trees and so forth that have cones on them. And also hardwood forests. And as I mentioned, this area stretches from the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec and then down through Vermont and New Hampshire. And we'll have a separate section when we talk about the Appalachians. So geologically, you could say that the Appalachians stretch all the way up into this area. We don't tend to think of this area being part of the cultural part of Appalachia, so we'll talk about that separately. The two other areas that we want to take a look at are the Canadian Shield and the continental shelf. Canadian Shield, you want to remember, is the oldest portion of the North American continent. This is sometimes called the Craton, C-R-A-T-O-N, and that just means the original part of the continent that was formed back when the globe looked much, much different than it does today. So this makes this area some of the oldest rock on the continent. This was also, of course, sculpted by glaciers. This area this far north was covered in glaciers during the Ice Age, the last Ice Age. It's also very rocky because of this, because of the topsoil being sort of scraped away. But through some of the folding and tectonic processes that went on in this area, you have a lot of minerals that were formed, and one that is particularly valuable in the area is nickel. The continental shelf is the area that's offshore, and so some areas that we'll see on the continent drop off into deep water ocean very quickly once you get offshore. In some areas, there's this long shelf that extends out away from the coast that is fairly shallow water. And so around the North Atlantic provinces of Canada, you have about 200 to 350 miles of a continental shelf extending out. We'll take a look at this again in a second. This area is known as the Grand Banks. And so this, in historical geography, we'll talk about as an area that was really important for cod fishing. Cod in particular really like this kind of shallow, cold water. And because part of the reason that it's so great for fish life is because the water is relatively shallow, and so sunlight penetrates and helps to produce abundant plant life and also sea life. So not only the fish, but also lots of plankton, which the fish love to feed on. So if we take a look at this continental shelf again on Google Earth, we can see this light blue color that extends out away from Newfoundland and the area here around Nova Scotia, and even this area around New England. So all of this space right here is continental shelf, and then you can see how it sort of drops off into deep water as you get further out. We're going to take a look at the water in this area. Water is incredibly important to lots of geographical regions, but here it's particularly significant. So we'll look at the rivers. I'm going to post a video for you about the Bay of Fundy, so you need to watch that. That's about the tides in the Bay of Fundy. And then we also want to take a look at how the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current interact in this area, which causes lots of bad weather like fog and storms and so forth. The rivers that we're going to take a look at are not monumental rivers in the scheme of things as we look around the other parts of the North American continent. But pause the video here and copy this chart down into your notes. Okay, so the rivers we'll look at are the St. Croix, the Penobscot, the Kennebec, and the St. John. And one thing we want to do, of course, is pay attention to the toponyms, the names in this area, because that gives us a clue about the people who were there who chose these names that have endured on the map. And so you can see that the two of these words, Penobscot and Kennebec, were named after the indigenous peoples who lived there, the Native American groups. And the other two are religious names that, of course, relate and give us a clue to the French Catholic presence in the area. So St. Croix or Saint Croix is Holy Cross, and St. John is named after John the Baptist, an important figure in the Bible. We can look at the links here and see that just like the ones we looked at further south in the area around the megalopolis, they're not significantly long rivers. The St. John would be the one that is the most lengthy of all these, and we'll take a look at where this exists. One thing that we will also want to pay attention to with toponyms, or with the names of places, is that sometimes Europeanized names were overlaid on top of names that the Native American peoples in that area gave to that space. And so there is some effort in a lot of places to rename or to take back some of the older names. So for example, with the St. John River, the Wolastoq, it was the native name for this place, which meant, or this river, which meant bountiful and good. We can see that all of these rivers ultimately flow into the Atlantic Ocean, but this coastline has these bays and gulfs and so forth that exist before the water actually is part of the North Atlantic. The river we also want to pay attention to here with the St. John is that it forms a portion of the international boundary between Maine and New Brunswick, the Canadian province of New Brunswick and the American state of Maine. And the St. Croix River also forms part of this border. further out. So if we take a look at these rivers on Google Earth, we see the St. John flows here from sort of northwestern Maine along this line here through New Brunswick and out to the Bay of Fundy. The St. Croix forms this part of the Maine and New Brunswick border, so it's much shorter. And then you have the Penobscot River that flows down here through Bangor, Maine. And then you have the Kennebec River that flows down here through Augusta, Maine. And you can see how indented that coastline is. Lots of little islands off the coast and very rocky kind of shore along the Gulf of Maine. This river forms kind of an interesting historical story because this area was contested between the United States and Canada for a long time. It wasn't solved until 1842. This boundary was finally agreed upon between the British and the United States. But you can see that in a lot of ways Maine really, one way you could look at it is that Maine kind of intrudes on a lot of this area that is very close to the center of the Canadian corridor. So these international boundary lines really are on the ground, particularly where they're straight on the ground, they're fairly arbitrary. If we look close in, we can see that this is the United States and that is Canada. But you can also see that this is not an area that has a lot of people. So particularly this area of northern Maine is not terribly populated. But this river became one way to set a boundary. And of course, when you set rivers, then you have to agree on where that river boundary should extend to. And so you can imagine that in this kind of boundary dispute, the Americans wanted this space all the way to the edge of the St. John rivers. Actually, the Americans wanted all of New Brunswick, and the Canadians were pushing for a boundary that was much further south. So the second area of water that we want to pay attention to is the Bay of Fundy. So this is this area that's between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And I'll post a video for you to watch, but one of the things that's really interesting about this area is the way the tide flows in and back out, in and out, and how high that tide is. So the spaces that it flows into and out of. And so you'll see the change in the sea level as the tide comes in and out of this space, and you can kind of tell just by the sort of the muddiness of this area how the tide would flood and then recede over the course of a day. And then the other thing we want to pay attention to is as we come out here offshore, we have two major ocean currents coming together right here. One is the Gulf Stream that runs from the Gulf of Mexico and flows kind of in this northeasterly direction along here, and actually is part of what keeps Europe warmer than it should be for its latitude. So the Gulf Stream brings warmer waters here this direction. You also have another current coming down from the Labrador up here, the Labrador Sea, and this is very cold water because it's coming from the Arctic, and so it's flowing down this direction. And so where those two collide or run past each other right through here, you've got the cold Labrador water and the warm Gulf Stream water. Those two coming together create fog and storms. When you have cold and hot or cold and warm colliding together, you get that kind of effect there. And so that makes these coastlines fairly stormy a lot of the time, and makes ocean-going travel there somewhat hazardous at times. Let's take a look at some of the features of the cultural geography of this area. When we're looking at New England, here we're paying attention to sort of the area around New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And there's a couple of things we could say are part of the cultural landscape, meaning things that the people who live there have sort of inscribed on the landscape as being important to their culture. One of those is lobster. So lobster is important as a food source, as a source of income, but also somewhat as a cultural signifier. You might think of it as being similar to sort of the attitude toward barbecue in Texas. You know, if you're a real Texan, you eat beef brisket barbecue or steak or something, and so there's that sort of attitude that sort of goes along with the traditional culture of that area. So for people in Maine, that would be lobster. Another thing you see on the landscape a lot are covered bridges, and these have of course, a utility purpose to them. They keep the snow off the bridges and allow them to be a little bit safer during the heavy winter. But they also have a sort of aesthetic appeal to them as well. And so even after a time when bridges could be engineered perhaps not to collapse when they have too much snow or something, they still build them because they try to preserve them because they're part of the cultural landscape there. Another thing you see are rock walls built around the fields. So in areas where you have timber, you might make fences out of timber and so forth. But the fields in this area were so rocky that as farmers were clearing the fields, they would take these stacks of rocks out to the edge of the field and pile them up. And so that made a nice way to sort of build a boundary around certain fields, was to use the rocks from the field to build these rock walls. And so those have also been preserved as something that's important to the history and the cultural landscape. Another idea that we want to pay attention to here in New England is this idea of massification. And so the idea here is that New England is somewhat being invaded by wealthy people from Massachusetts. That's where massification comes from. And so wealthier people, particularly from Boston, will buy up high-priced luxury housing that they use for vacations or retirement. And there's a bit of a tension about this because these people might be seen as sort of being outsiders, and that they don't really contribute to the year-round economy and that kind of thing. And so massification is a cultural process where people feel as if they've been invaded somewhat from another part of the region. People out west use the term Californication to mean areas where lots of Californians are moving into Idaho and Montana and Nevada and Colorado and so forth, and building expensive homes and that sort of thing. So the other two areas we want to look at in terms of cultural geography are the Maritimes and Newfoundland. And so the Maritimes are these three provinces: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Sorry, there should be a D there that got cut off the page. And the group we want to pay particular attention to here are the Acadians. And they're mostly associated with Nova Scotia. So you want to kind of think about Acadians as being the area of Nova Scotia. In historical geography, we talk more about this being called Acadia first, and so that's where they got their name, Acadians. These were mostly Catholic French colonial settlers who intermarried with the Micmacs, the native group in that area. After the 7 Years' War, so this was 1754 to 1763. I know that's longer than 7 years, but that's what they call it in that area. Sometimes it's also called the French and Indian War in American history. But this is the war before the American Revolution, in which the British defeated the French and took most of the holdings of the French in North America. And so Nova Scotia was one of the things that changed hands from French control to British control. The people in this area, many of them were fairly poor farmers, maybe not poor, but certainly not rich. And many of them, of course, refused loyalty to the British after the 7 Years' War. There was also, of course, some suspicion among the British that these people wouldn't be loyal to them. And because they were somewhat poor, they were fairly easy to abuse, as powerful groups tend to do. So these people, the Acadians, were expelled from this area, basically deported out of Nova Scotia. Some were sent back to France, a place they had never lived. Some were sent to the Caribbean, to where the French did hold on to some of their holdings in places like Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And some ultimately made their way to Louisiana. And so this expulsion began actually during the war, and continued into the decades after this period. And so this group, when we take a look at the Gulf Coast, we'll talk about the Cajun culture. And so the Cajuns of South Louisiana are descendants of the Acadians. And part of how that word Cajun came about is that if you say, "I am Acadian," in French, it's said, "Je suis Acadien." And so that word, "Je suis Acadien," or that phrase, I am Acadian, got shortened to Cajun, and that's where the Cajuns of South Louisiana come from. And so people that live down in the swampy areas of South Louisiana are descendants of these people who lived in this hard-scrabble, cold place of Nova Scotia. The other area we want to look at is Newfoundland, and so it looks like it might be pronounced New-found-land. The people who live there pronounce found more as like fund, and so it's Newfoundland. And one thing we want to pay attention to here is St. John's, which was founded in 1583 and has the distinction of being the first English colony in North America. I know in Jamestown they will tell you that was the first colony, and it was for the United States, but the English had a colony in St. John's even prior to Jamestown. This area was very dependent on the cod fishery, and so this is where that area of the Grand Banks comes in. The cod is what drew people from Europe over there. But this fishery collapsed due to overfishing. I'll post a video on this one as well for you. And collapsed in 1992. And so it's created some economic strife in the area. This is also an area that's fairly isolated, and so you have a very distinct dialect. The way people there talk is different from some of the surrounding areas. So there's a very distinct regional way of saying things and pronouncing things that almost sounds somewhat Scottish to me at times, and that makes sense from the people who settled into that area. So for the cultural geography, we took a look at the lobster, or as they say in Maine, lobster, and the rock walls around farms, and the covered bridges of Maine. The maritime provinces are these right through here. So we've got New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. And then if we head out here, we see Newfoundland. And so we can see how separated it is from these other spaces. And St. John's is this oldest English colony that's right here on the tip of this, this little peninsula that juts out into the North Atlantic. And so we can understand why this might have been an early English colony if we kind of zoom back out and see what's going on across the globe here. So what was drawing people to this area was the cod in these Grand Banks. Here's England over here, and you can see England and Ireland are also surrounded by a continental shelf here. And so cod were also being fished in this area to supply protein for Europeans, and they tended to overfish this area, and so fishermen were heading out further afield to try to find other places. And so you can see as they were sort of heading out here to Iceland and along the coast of Greenland, it only made sense that they would end up down into this area. And so they were fishing seasonally back and forth across this area, and that's why they set up these originally seasonal homes, seasonal fishing villages and trading villages, but ultimately these became permanent settlements. Let's take a look at the climate in this area. And so one city that we'll take a look at is Halifax, Nova Scotia. And if you remember, what we want to do is determine, first of all, if it's a C or a D climate. And the thing we want to look at, again, is how cold it is in the coldest month. Typically that's January. If the January average temperature is below freezing, that makes it a D climate. So here we obviously have a D climate. It's the average temperature 23 degrees in January. Then we look at the rainfall for our second letter, our precipitation, and we see whether or not these bars of precipitation, monthly precipitation averages, exceed an inch. And so here we can see these definitely exceed an inch, and you can see a degree of seasonality here, a fairly wet winter, relatively drier summer, but still lots of rain, 4 inches of rain on average per month, and up to 6 or so. Of course, a lot of this is snow as well in the wintertime. So we have a F climate, and I think of that as being like F for full year of rain. So a D and then an F for full year of rain or precipitation. And then the last letter we look at is the summer temperature, or the warmest month. And if it's below 71.5 degrees, then we have a B climate. If it's above that, we have an A climate, or hot summer. So here we have a DF for the full year of rain, and a B climate for the cooler summer. So that means we have a DFB, which is a humid continental mild summer climate. If we head over to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, we see a similar pattern. D, cold in the winter, full year of rain, not quite as much as Halifax gets, but still a full year of rain, so DF, and then also a cool, mild summer, so a B climate there, DFB, humid continental mild summer. St. John, New Brunswick, again, DFB. We can see the seasonality in the precipitation, a much wetter winter than summer, but cold in the winter, mild in the summer, DFB. If we go down to Augusta, Maine, then, we get a little bit different situation here. Cold in the winter, they don't have as much rain in the winter as, or precipitation, snow, as they do further north in the Maritimes. More of a wet fall, but then they've got a much warmer summer, and so this is a DFA climate, which means humid continental hot summer. So the Maritimes all have DFB, but in this area we still see a DFA, a warmer climate there in the summertime in Augusta, Maine. Next, we want to take a look at the population of this area. And so when we looked at the megalopolis and parts of the Canadian corridor, we saw large and growing populations. This area of the North Atlantic and northern New England has roughly 5.5 million people. So that's actually smaller than the population of the DFW Metroplex. Not only is it fairly small in terms of population numbers, but those population numbers are actually declining. So we see people leaving, but part of the issue too is aging. And so the people who are staying in place there tend to be older residents who have decided to stay there and retire. It's a fairly rural population, so there aren't a lot of large cities that are drawing a diverse economy and drawing young people. So young people tend to leave, older people tend to stay there, and then of course ultimately die, and those people that are dying are not being replaced by new young families with lots of babies and so forth. Part of the reason for that is that there just aren't that many jobs. And so once the jobs that tended to sustain the area, like fishing and forestry or timber, lumbering, and mining, all declined, that tended to mean that people didn't have a lot of opportunities there, and they tended to leave. And not only that, but it's also expensive to live there. So the cost of living is high, and there aren't very many jobs, and so not a lot of opportunities. And so, of course, young people tend to not stick around, and that means that there's a low birth rate because there aren't very many young people staying there and having children. If we take a look at some population pyramids, if you've taken human geography with me, you've learned how to interpret these, but in essence, we have a male population on one side, a female population on the other. Each one of these bars represents an age group. So from 0 to 5, people from 5 to 10, from 10 to 15, and so forth, all the way up to 80. So the people in this bracket right here are in their late 50s, early 60s. And so when we see a shape like this, if you've taken human geography, hopefully you can look at this right away and go, that's a declining population. You don't have very many young people who are going to be moving up into this population and having more children to then grow the population. You've got a big bulge here of people from their mid-40s to mid-60s that are the bulk of the population. And so that is an aging population, and as this bulge of people begin to age up and die, there's not as many people down in these younger groups who will move up and replace that large bulge. So this is a declining population. If we take a look at some of the Atlantic provinces then, we can see the same kind of pattern in Nova Scotia, a declining population, very few children being born. Most of the people in the population, the largest cohort, are in their late 40s or mid 40s to mid 60s. Same kind of thing going on in Prince Edward Island. Here you even see a real dent of people in their late 20s, early 30s. So as people who are younger, these people are the parents probably of these teenagers here. When these teenagers graduate from high school or college, bang, they leave. So people in their mid-20s don't tend to stick around. And so these people in their mid-20s to mid-30s who are having children are not living, there aren't as many of them anymore, and so they aren't having as many children. Same thing going on in Newfoundland and Labrador. Very few young people, lots of people middle-aged to retirement age. So these are all pyramids that show us a declining population. So a lot of the reason for that declining population, of course, is that this was an area that historically had great dependence on natural resources. You can think of these as extractive industries, industries where people are extracting natural resources from the land or from the ocean. So mining, logging, and fishing. None of these are terribly profitable or sustainable kinds of activities today. The fishing industry has essentially fished itself out and can't compete globally. Many of the forests have been logged out or they've been now protected. The mines have essentially extracted the easiest to get to kinds of resources, and so mining is not particularly profitable or sustainable. So what you have instead, taking their place of those natural resource industries, are what are called amenity economies. And so amenity economies mean that you turn the place over more to tourism. And so you're trying to attract people to come there because it's, there's scenic beauty, it's got a nice mild summer, and so people, again, from Massachusetts and so forth, wealthier New Englanders, may have second homes up there. You might have people who go up there for vacation, and you might have some sort of recreational tourism, boating and fishing and hiking and that sort of thing. But those aren't sustainable kinds of things for the local residents. Those jobs don't pay very well, and they're not very stable. We can see certainly during the pandemic period, COVID-19, tourism is not something that's generating a lot of money. So the agricultural industry, though, does still exist, but it's a smaller, more niche kind of operation. In Maine, the blueberries grow particularly well, and so blueberries like the sort of cold and the wet. Potatoes also grow well in the sort of rocky soil that exists there. Vermont is really known for its dairies, and so there isn't a lot of great agricultural land for farming, but there is good dairy opportunity there, and so they've developed a dairy kind of tradition, and that sustains some of the Vermont economy. Prince Edward Island is known for its potatoes, so also places where you have kind of not so great soil and cold climates, potatoes tend to do fine. When we get into the secondary sector, manufacturing has really been in decline in recent decades. This area in the 19th century was really known for textiles, paper mills, and so forth, but much of that has disappeared in recent decades. So many of the jobs in this economy that remain are in the service sector, the tertiary sector. And so, of course, we've mentioned tourism already, but healthcare, of course, when you have an aging population, you have need for healthcare. The trouble with particularly tourism jobs, but also healthcare in the sense of kind of the home health aid sort of industry, is that these jobs tend to be lower paying and less stable than the old jobs in, say, mining or textile mills, paper mills, fishing, logging, those kinds of things. So those manufacturing jobs were lost, and those jobs that replace them are not as stable and don't pay as well as the ones that were there before. So that helps us understand why people in their 20s and 30s might want to leave and move someplace else.